In the year 356 BC, beneath the shadowed hills of Macedon, a child was born whose name would thunder through the corridors of time. Alexander, son of Philip, son of Olympias, heir to a kingdom that dared to dream beyond its borders. The night he came into the world, the air was heavy with omens. Far to the east, the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus burned to the ground. The sign, the soothsayers whispered, that a force had entered the world to unmake empires. In the palace at Pella, the young prince grew under the watchful eyes of two towering figures. Philip, his father, the warrior king who forged Macedon from a scattered realm into a spear aimed at Greece. Olympias, his mother, fierce, mystical, unyielding, who whispered to her son that his blood was not merely mortal, but divine. She told him of Achilles, the great hero of Troy, and claimed that the same fire burned in his veins. When the boy was 13, Philip sought a mind worthy to shape the mind of a king. He found it in Aristotle, philosopher, scientist, and keeper of Greece's ancient wisdom. In a grove of trees, far from the noise of the court, Alexander learned of Homer's epics, the movements of the stars, the laws of men, the secrets of the earth. Yet, in every lesson, one truth burned brighter than the rest, that to live greatly was to live as if one's name would never fade. One day, a great black horse was brought before Philip. The beast, wild-eyed, untamed, threw every man who dared approach. The court laughed, but Alexander saw something others did not. The horse was afraid of its own shadow. He turned it towards the sun, mounted without fear, and rode it until it bowed to his will. Bucephalus, as he named it, would carry him through deserts and across continents until both horse and rider vanished into legend. From the hills of Macedon, Alexander looked towards the east, towards the glittering cities of Persia, the sands of Egypt, and the mountains of India. The horizon called to him, not as a boundary, but as a promise. He was not yet a man, but already the world felt too small. And though his father's shadow was vast, Alexander would one day eclipse it, not by accident, but by destiny. But destiny is a cruel master, and the road to greatness is paved not only with triumphs, but with the bones of those who stood in the way. By the time Alexander reached his teenage years, his father, Philip II, had become the master of Greece. The proud city-states, Athens, Thebes, Corinth, all bent the knee not by choice, but by the weight of Macedonian steel. Yet, within the palace walls, shadows lingered. Philip's victories brought him glory, but also enemies. Enemies who would one day strike with fatal precision. Philip's conquests fed his ambition, but his heart was restless. He took new wives, weaving alliances through marriage. One such union with a Macedonian noblewoman brought public insult to Olympias and to Alexander himself. At a royal feast, a drunken general raised a toast for Philip to sire a legitimate heir. Alexander, enraged, hurled his cup and spat in defiance. Father and son clashed with words sharper than any blade, and for a time, Alexander walked away from the court, uncertain of his place. In 336 BC, Philip stood at the height of his power. The Persian Empire awaited his invasion, yet fate, with its cruel hand, intervened. At the wedding of his daughter, in the theater of Aegea, Philip entered to the cheers of the crowd and fell to the dagger of an assassin. His blood stained the stones before the throne he had built. Whether the plot was born of personal vengeance, political intrigue, or the whispers of Olympias herself, none could say with certainty. Alexander was 20 years old when the crown was placed upon his head. The throne of Macedon was his, but thrones, like empires, rest on unstable ground. Rivals within the court doubted his youth. Greek city-states sensed weakness and began to stir. Across the Aegean, the Persian king watched with interest, perhaps hoping the boy would crumble under the weight of the crown. They were wrong. When Thebes rebelled, Alexander did not send envoys. He sent an army. In a storm of bronze and fire, the city that had once defied Sparta itself was reduced to rubble. Its walls shattered, its people sold into slavery, its name struck from the map, all to send a single message to Greece, that Alexander was not Philip's shadow, he was Philip's successor, and the wrath of Macedon burned hotter than ever. When Greece bowed once more, Alexander turned his eyes east. Across the waters lay the vast Persian Empire, an ancient giant, rich beyond imagining, ruled by a man who had yet to face the son of Philip. The greatest war the world had yet seen was about to begin. In the spring of 334 BC, the boy king of Macedon stepped onto the shore of destiny. With 37,000 men, veterans hardened in the walls of Greece, Alexander crossed the narrow strait of the Hellespont into Asia. This was no mere invasion. To the Greeks, it was the beginning of vengeance, payback for the Persian wars of a century past. To Alexander, it was the first step toward an empire that would span the known world. Before marching inland, Alexander made a detour into the ruins of Troy. There, upon the windswept plain, he offered sacrifice at the tomb of Achilles, his hero. In full armor, he ran a race in honor of the fallen warrior, as if to prove that the spirit of Troy still lives within him. And there, he took the sacred shield of Achilles to carry not just as a relic, but as a promise. News of Macedonian arrival raced ahead, carried on the tongues of traders and spies. At the river Granicus, a Persian army gathered to block their advance, led by satraps loyal to King Darius III. The river ran swift and cold, its banks steep, a natural barrier the Persians believed unassailable. Alexander's generals urged caution. To attack across a river under a rain of arrows was folly. But Alexander saw what they could not, that hesitation was more dangerous than any enemy. He donned a shiny helmet with white plumes, mounted Bucephalus, and charged into the current. Arrows and spears struck around him, yet he pressed on. The clash at the far bank was a maelstrom of bronze and blood, but the Macedonian phalanx soon followed, pinning the Persians in place. By day's end, the Persian line shattered, and their commanders lay dead. City after city opened its gates. Sardis, the jewel of Lydia, surrendered without a fight. The Greek cities along the coast, long under Persian control, welcomed Alexander as a liberator. He restored their democracies, earning both their loyalty and their resources. Each step forward tightened his grip on Asia Minor and set the stage for a confrontation with the great king himself. But Darius III was no mere satrap. His pride could not suffer this Macedonian upstart much longer. Far to the east, the King of Kings began to gather an army the likes of which the world had never seen, and Alexander would march to meet him. The victory at Granicus opened the gates of Asia Minor, but Alexander knew the heart of the empire lay far to the east. In the autumn of 333 BC, word reached him that the King of Kings himself, Darius III, had marched west with a massive host, a force said to dwarf anything Alexander had yet faced. Rather than wait, Alexander drove his men north along the coast, into the narrow lands of Cilicia. determined to bring the Persian monarch to battle. At Issus, the gods dealt their hand. By a twist of fate, or perhaps the cunning of Alexander, Darius found himself on the wrong side of the narrow coastal pass, his vast army bottled between the mountains and the sea. There, numbers counted for little. The Persians could not outflank. Alexander had turned the field itself into a weapon. The river Penarus cut the field, its banks steep and slippery. On one side stood the Macedonian phalanx, a wall of spears gleaming beneath a grey sky. On the other, the Persian host, archers, cavalry, and the immortal guard of Darius, their shields adorned with gold. The air trembled with the twang of bowstrings. Arrows darkened the heavens as Alexander led his right wing forward, striking like a spearhead into the Persian flank. The battle became a storm of men and metal. The Macedonian phalanx locked the Persians in place, their sarissars thrusting with relentless precision. Alexander, with his companion cavalry, carved a path towards the heart of the enemy, towards Darius himself, who stood in a chariot surrounded by his royal guard. The moment the Macedonian charge breached the line, Darius's courage failed. Turning his chariot, the King of Kings fled the field, his royal standard falling into enemy hands. The Persian army collapsed in chaos, trampled under its own retreat. In the aftermath, the tent of Darius was found, a palace of silk and gold amid the mud and blood of the battlefield. There, Alexander discovered the king's family, his mother, wife, and children, abandoned in the flight. They trembled before him, fearing death or slavery. Instead, Alexander treated them with honor, assuring them that no harm would come. For a conqueror, he understood well the value of magnanimity. Issus had been more than a victory. It was a proclamation. The young king of Macedon had humbled the lord of Asia in their first encounter. But Darius still ruled the largest empire in the world, and in the east, he was raising an army unlike any the Greeks had ever seen. After Issus, the road to Egypt lay open. Rather than chase Darius into the heart of Persia, Alexander turned south, striking along the coast through Phoenicia. Tyre, proud, unyielding, a city upon the sea, refused him entry. For 7 long months, the Macedonians labored, building a causeway to breach its island walls. When at last the city fell, Alexander's vengeance was swift. Yet, his mercy to those who surrendered won him allies as well as fear. By the winter of 332 BC, Alexander entered Egypt without a fight. The Persians who ruled it had fled before his approach, and the Egyptian people hailed him not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. They crowned him pharaoh, placing upon his head the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, a symbol that he now ruled both as warrior and god-king. But Alexander sought more than crowns. Deep in the western desert, in an oasis called Siwa, stood the temple of the oracle of Ammon, a god the Greeks identified with Zeus himself. Against the advice of many, Alexander led a small party through blistering heat and shifting sands to reach the shrine. There, within its sacred walls, the high priest greeted him not as son of Philip, but as son of Zeus Ammon. The words, shrouded in mystery, would never be spoken in detail by Alexander. Yet from that day, he carried himself with the bearing of one touched by the divine. On his return to the Nile Delta, Alexander marked the site where sea met fertile land, where trade could flow from east to west. There, he ordered the foundation of a city, Alexandria, that would become a beacon of learning and commerce for centuries to come. Its streets were laid out in precise grids, its harbor deep enough for fleets, its future designed to outlive the man who conceived it. By the time he left Egypt, Alexander was no longer simply the king of Macedon. He was Pharaoh of Egypt, conqueror of the eastern Mediterranean, and in the whispers of both Greeks and Egyptians, the living god. But in his heart, one prize remained: the defeat of Darius and the claiming of Persia itself. And to achieve it, he would face the greatest battle of his life. In the autumn of 331 BC, the two greatest armies on earth stood poised to decide the fate of the world. Darius III, stung by defeat at Issus, had summoned every resource of the Persian Empire, from the steppes of Scythia to the shores of India. On the plains near Gaugamela, he assembled a host so vast that its dust cloud could be seen for miles. Chariots fitted with sighting blades, war elephants from the east, and tens of thousands of cavalry stood ready to crush the Macedonian spearhead. On the eve of battle, Darius ordered the field leveled to give his chariots free rein. His soldiers feasted, confident in their numbers. Across the plain, Alexander's camp lay quiet. His generals urged a night attack, but Alexander refused. "I will not steal my victory," he said. "I will take it in the light of day, before the eyes of the world." Under the stars, his men slept knowing that dawn might be their last. The battle began with a thunderous charge. Persian chariots hurtled forward, their blades flashing in the sun, but Alexander had prepared. His men opened their ranks at the last moment, letting the chariots pass through into a killing ground where javelins and spears awaited. The Macedonian phalanx advanced like an iron tide, while on the flanks, cavalry clashed in clouds of dust. Then came Alexander's masterstroke. Feigning weakness on his right, he drew the Persian cavalry out of position, creating a gap in their line. At the perfect moment, he led the companion cavalry in a wedge formation, driving straight towards Darius at the center. The ground shook beneath the charge. As the point of the wedge struck, panic rippled through the Persian guard. Once again, Darius turned his chariot and fled, his royal standard abandoned to the enemy. The heart of the Persian army collapsed. Yet, even in victory, Alexander's discipline held, turning to rescue his left wing, which was hard-pressed by Persian counterattacks. By sunset, the field belonged to Macedon. Tens of thousands lay dead, and the empire of Persia was broken. Gaugamela was more than a battle. It was the end of an age. The rule of the Achaemenid kings, stretching back 2 centuries, had been swept away in a single day. Alexander was now master of Asia, heir to the title King of Kings. But the man who ruled the known world had not yet reached the limits of his ambition. Ahead lay the treasures of Persepolis, the mysteries of the East, and lands so distant they seemed to touch the edge of heaven. After Gaugamela, the heart of Persia lay open. Babylon, Susa, and the royal city of Persepolis each fell before the conqueror. In Persepolis, Alexander stood in the halls of the great kings, the walls gleaming with gold and carved stone lions. Yet, even amid such splendor, his gaze was fixed eastward. He had inherited an empire, but sought to surpass it. One night, amid drunken revelry, Persepolis burned. Whether by accident, vengeance for the Persian sack of Athens, or deliberate symbolism, the flames devoured the palace of Darius. The glow lit the mountains for miles, a funeral pyre for an empire. Alexander marched on, through deserts, mountains, and the harsh heartlands of Bactria and Sogdiana, where resistance was fierce and winter beat deep. In the east, Alexander wove his empire together with politics as well as war. In Susa, He took the Persian princess Roxana as his wife, a union of Macedonian steel and Persian silk. Thousands of his followers followed suit, wedding women of conquered lands. But in the camps, whispers grew. Macedonian veterans, hardened by years of war, saw their king becoming something foreign. In 327 BC, the horizon changed. The army crossed into the Punjab, a land of monsoon rains, dense jungles, and rivers wider than any they had ever seen. The Indian kings sent envoys bearing strange gifts, elephants, spices, and gold. Yet one ruler refused submission, King Porus, who commanded a host unlike any Alexander had faced. The Hydaspes River swelled with the season's floods. Porus waited on the far bank with war elephants towering above his lines, their tusks sheathed in iron. Under cover of night and storm, Alexander led a daring crossing upriver. At dawn, the Macedonian cavalry swept down towards Porus's flank. The elephants charged, crushing men beneath their feet, scattering cavalry like dry leaves. Yet Alexander's discipline held. His archers aimed for the mahouts, while phalanx spears pierced the beast's armor. Hours of brutal combat followed, the ground churning to mud and blood. At last, wounded and surrounded, Porus surrendered. Brought before Alexander, Porus was asked how he wished to be treated. The Indian king answered, like a king. Admiring his courage, Alexander restored him to the throne, making him an ally rather than a prisoner. It was a moment of respect between two warriors at the edge of the known world. But beyond the Hydaspes lay even greater rivers, greater kingdoms, and the edge of the world itself. It was there that Alexander's men, weary from years of war, would finally refuse to march. Beyond the Hydaspes lay the Hyphasis River. Alexander dreamed of marching east until the ocean marked the world's end. But here, for the first time, the will of his men broke. 8 years of constant war had worn them to the bone. They longed for their homes, for the hills of Macedonia and the warmth of familiar hearths. Alexander summoned his officers, his voice a fire of ambition. He spoke of lands yet to conquer, of glory yet to claim, of how they would be written in the annals of eternity. But the army, united in defiance, refused to cross the Hyphasis. The Conqueror wept in rage and frustration. For the first time, the march of Alexander had been halted not by an enemy, but by his own people. Reluctantly, Alexander turned south, leading his forces down the Indus River. Along the way, he crushed uprisings and fortified cities to secure his empire's eastern edge. Yet, the return journey would prove more deadly than any battle he had fought. In 325 BC, Alexander led his army through the Gedrosian Desert, a decision historians still debate. The heat was merciless, water scarce, and sandstorms swallowed entire columns. Thousands perished, their bones bleaching beneath the desert sky. It was as if the earth itself sought to punish the king for his ambition. When Alexander returned to Babylon, the city welcomed him as a living god. He planned new campaigns, an invasion of Arabia, and beyond that, perhaps the western edge of the world. But the fates had other designs. In June of 326 BC, after a night of feasting, Alexander fell ill. Fever gripped him, growing worse with each passing day. He could no longer speak, but when his soldiers filed past his bed, he greeted them with a silent nod, the last act of a king who had led from the front. On the 10th day of his illness, Alexander the Great died. He was 32 years old. His body was said to remain incorrupt for days, as if even decay bowed to him. The empire he carved from Greece to India shattered within months, torn apart by his generals. Yet his name endured, a beacon of ambition, brilliance, and the fleeting nature of glory. They called him a god, yet he was mortal. They called him immortal, yet his empire faded like smoke. But the legend of Alexander, the boy who set out from Macedonia and reshaped the world, would never end.